In our previous episode, we discussed Oswald's journey from Texas to Europe by way of France, England, and Helsinki, Finland, and finally to Moscow in Russia. When he initially requested Russian citizenship, his request was denied, which led Oswald to attempt suicide by slashing his wrist. There are discussed disputes as to whether he truly intended to take his own life. It is entirely possible that the act was a bit of a show to ensure he could remain in the Soviet Union. Either way that one might look at that incident, the end result was that he was able to stay in Russia, which is exactly what he wanted to do at that time, after Oswald was released from the hospital. He was taken back to the Metropole Hotel by his tour guide, Rema Chirikova. As far as we know, Oswald spent the next few days in the hotel. We have no reports stating what he may have been doing during this period of time. But on October 31st, 1959, Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He told them he was a Marxist. He then tossed his passport across the desk of the embassy consul. He then asserted that he was going to give the Soviets all the information he had accumulated while in the military. This radar operation information he possessed was quite valuable and a classified secret. Richard Snyder was a consul at the U.S. Embassy when Oswald tried to defect. This is how Snyder described his first interaction with Oswald. Quote, "His manner was aggressive, arrogant, uncooperative. He appeared to be competent. He was contemptuous of any effort by the interviewing staff officer and made it clear that he wanted no advice from the embassy." Oswald gave, as the principal reason for his defection, "I am a Marxist," declassified HSCA documents from another consul at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. John McVicker tells us more about Oswald's state of mind. McVicker said, quote, "It seemed to me the possibility that he was following a pattern of behavior in which he had been tutored or coached by person or persons unknown. It seemed to me that there was a possibility that he had been in contact with others before or during his Marine Corps tour who had guided him or encouraged him in his actions. If McVicker's hunch is correct, then who could have possibly tutored Oswald on what to say? Given that this is at the height of the Cold War, the KGB and the CIA would both be prime suspects if Oswald was being coached. McVicker's statement alone doesn't prove that, but it certainly brings up a possibility. Oswald said he would share information he learned as a Marine radar operator with the Soviets. This would have been enough for Oswald to have been charged with espionage and arrested on sight. But that's not what happened. Not only did the U.S. Embassy not arrest Oswald, they may have gone out of their way to help him to not lose his American citizenship. 3 days before Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy, on October 28, 1959, Consul Richard Snyder sent a confidential letter to Gene Boster, the officer in charge of Soviet affairs at the State Department. In that letter, Snyder requested advice on how to handle an attempted renunciation of American citizenship. Specifically, it asked if the official protocols should be avoided if there's an American defector, in the interest of leaving, quote, "such avenues of repatriation as possible open to future contingencies." Leaving the door open to future repatriation is exactly what Snyder did for Oswald. But Snyder told the Warren Commission his letter wasn't about any particular case, and that he had only ever encountered one case where a person wanted to renounce their citizenship prior to Oswald's appearance, and that case had already been resolved. The timing of Snyder's letter seems strange because it is basically requesting permission to not follow protocols for American defectors, to make it easier for them to change their minds later. And then, 3 days after this letter walks Lee Harvey Oswald to the embassy consul desk, and Snyder makes sure that he does not legally defect, so that Oswald can repatriate easily later on. To further add to the intrigue surrounding the U.S. Embassy, there's a cablegram that was sent by the naval attaché there to the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. on November 3rd. That cable references another communication about Lee Harvey Oswald on October 26th, 2 days before Snyder sent the letter. But we have no record of the actual document that was sent on October 26th, other than the fact that it's mentioned in this November 3rd communique. What could that other letter about Oswald be, since Oswald didn't go to the embassy until 5 days later? Remember, Oswald was the third American defector in 1959. One thing that he had in common with his two predecessors, Nicholas Petrulli and Robert Webster, is that they all went to the U.S. Embassy to attempt to defect on a Saturday when the embassy was officially closed. And all three of these men were ultimately allowed to return to the United States. It turns out their defections were not legally effective on a Saturday when the embassy wasn't open for business. This left a path for them to return to the U.S. if they changed their minds later. Just like Snyder said in his October 28th letter, why did Consul Snyder care about the fate of these Americans who wanted to defect? Was he just looking out for Americans and trying to be nice? Maybe. That is certainly one interpretation. Another interpretation could be that there was some other reason why Snyder wanted to make it easy for these soon-to-be expatriates to change their minds. In the 1950s, while Snyder was studying Russian at Harvard, he worked for the CIA as a spotter to recruit Russian speakers into Project Redskin. The primary goal of Project Redskin was to coordinate travelers who were going into the Soviet Union for legitimate reasons, like business or tourism, and then have those people gather information and pass that information on to the CIA. We don't know that Snyder was actively working for the CIA while he was stationed at the embassy, but it wouldn't be surprising at all if he was, since he had been helping the agency in the past. Ultimately, Oswald never signed the required renouncement papers to effectuate his formal defection. Whether it would have counted on a Saturday or not, Snyder told Oswald to come back the next Monday to sign the papers, but Oswald didn't do that. While Oswald never legally defected to Russia, it was clear what his stated intentions were. He handed over his passport and a written statement that his citizenship in the United States be revoked. Nevertheless, his American citizenship was never formally renounced because the specific required paperwork had not been processed on a business day, meaning that Oswald never legally defected to the Soviet Union. Pretty slick side door trick if you think about it. Immediately after Oswald left the U.S. Embassy, he started to have reporters contacting him, looking for an interview about why he wanted to defect. After he turned down 2 male reporters, he agreed to an interview with Aline Mosby on the same day that he visited the embassy. October 31st. Mosby admitted that she learned about Oswald from a contact at the U.S. Embassy who mentioned Oswald when she asked about story ideas. Mosby wrote a story that included Oswald's background and his reasons for wanting to live in the Soviet Union. Her article was published via United Press International, which had a very wide publishing reach. About 2 weeks later, Oswald was interviewed by another female reporter at Hotel Metropole, Priscilla Johnson. Johnson wrote an article similar to the one Mosby had written, but for her employer North American Newspaper Alliance. Incidentally, Priscilla Johnson would later go on to write a biography of Oswald with Marina Oswald. Aline Mosby told the HSCA that Priscilla Johnson worked for the CIA, and before Priscilla Johnson testified to the HSCA in 1978, she was granted immunity from prosecution for unknown reasons. Now, we don't really know where Oswald was from the time after his interview with Priscilla Johnson in mid-November until the end of 1959. The Warren Report says, quote, "For the rest of the year, Oswald seldom left his hotel room. How they knew that is anyone's guess." But the American Embassy notified the State Department on December 1st that, quote, Oswald had departed from the Hotel Metropole within the last few days for an unknown destination. Separately, Oswald's diary has one big entry that covers this block of time. In that entry, Oswald says that he acquired Russian language books and was studying the language full-time. Most of the other entries in Oswald's diary for days when he was just sitting in a hotel room are daily entries that include his meals and his feelings. For some reason, Oswald just wrote one big block of 6 weeks in one diary entry, where he says he's just sitting around the hotel. And again, the U.S. Embassy says that Oswald checked out of his hotel around the end of November. So where was Oswald really? It's possible that we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that on January 4th, 1960, Oswald was finally given a Soviet identity document for stateless persons and told by Soviet officials that he was being relocated to Minsk, 450 miles southwest of Moscow. Now, in previous episodes, we have talked about CIA connections at Albert Schweitzer College, and before that, David Bucknell said that he and Oswald had been working with the CIA while they were stationed at the Santa Ana base in California. But as far as the released documents trail goes, this is where the CIA officially enters the picture. On November 4th, 1959, about 4 days after Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, the Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C. sent a cable to the embassy in Moscow with background information about Lee Harvey Oswald. including that he was a Marine and may have had access to confidential, if not classified, information. The end of the cable requested updates on significant developments about Oswald, due to, quote, continuing interest by HQ Marine Corps and U.S. intelligence agencies. The last thing the cable says in all caps is, quote, intelligence matter. About a week after this cable, the FBI posted a wanted notice card for Lee Harvey Oswald. This wanted notice led to Oswald being added to a watch list for the H.T. Lingwall program. H.T. Lingwall was a joint project between the CIA, the FBI, and the U.S. Postal Service to open and read mail from select people that were sending mail to and from the Soviet Union and China. The program was headed up by the Special Investigations Group of the CIA and led by its chief of counterintelligence, James Angleton. Oswald was one of 300 Americans whose letters were opened and read as part of H.T. Lingwall. But if a program exists to read mail that is coming and going to Russia and China, it's not surprising that the CIA would want to keep tabs on Oswald, since he did tell the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that he was planning on giving military secrets to the Soviets. But what is surprising is that even though the CIA added Oswald to the H.T. Lingwall program, it didn't create a person of interest file for Oswald, known as a 201 file, until December 8, 1960. 13 months after Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, and more than a year after the CIA started reading Oswald's mail. According to the 1960 CIA Clandestine Services Handbook, 201 files are supposed to be opened on persons of active operational interest at any given point in time. The House Select Committee on Assassinations asked retired CIA Director Richard Helms about why the 201 file was not opened on Oswald at the time he defected, or later when the CIA became aware of him and started opening his mail. Helms said, quote, I'm amazed. Are you sure there wasn't? I can't explain that. So it was surprising to the former head of the CIA that Oswald didn't have a 201 file opened as soon as he showed up on the CIA's radar. Or at least that's what he testified to under oath to the HSCA, but what his actual real interpretation of this could easily be something far different than what he testified to. This is Richard Helms, after all. The HSCA followed up on this issue of the late opened 201 file by asking the CIA, quote, where documents concerning Oswald had been disseminated internally and stored prior to his 201 file being opened. In other words, the HSCA wanted to know if there was no 201 file opened when Oswald defected. Did the CIA have some other documents on Oswald that it was tracking? The CIA responded that there were documents, but because none of them were classified higher than confidential, they were all of low national security interest and were only retained for 5 years and then destroyed or thrown away. So those documents and what they may have contained no longer exist. Professor John Newman asked CIA officer Robert Benneman how the CIA Office of Security responded to Oswald's attempted defection. Benneman would know since he was the deputy director of the CIA's Department of Security at the time. Benneman told Newman, quote, the 201 opening was something we worked very closely with Angleton and his staff. When the HSCA asked Angleton's deputy at the CIA, Ray Roca, what caused the Special Investigation Group to open a file on Oswald. Roca implied but didn't confirm that Richard Bissell of the CIA may have been in contact with Oswald. The exchange went like this. Roca, it would be with respect to where and what happened to Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell's materials with respect to a defection in any of those places. HSCA. Again, though, Oswald had nothing to do with Richard Bissell at this time, at least apparently. Roca, I'm not saying that. You said that. So the CIA started tracking Oswald in the form of reading his mail in the H.T. Lingwall program, but the CIA, for whatever reason, did not open a standard 201 file on Oswald until a year later, apparently because Counterintelligence Chief James Angleton decided not to open the 201, according to Benneman. Roca's exchange with the HSCA about Richard Bissell is by no means a smoking gun. But Roca, Jim Angleton's deputy, isn't willing to confirm that Richard Bissell, a higher-ranking individual in the CIA, was not linked to Oswald. Now, that's not the same as him admitting that Oswald was linked to Bissell. Maybe Roca was just being extra cautious. But it sounds like he's saying that Oswald may have had involvement with Richard Bissell, the deputy director of plans for the CIA. That's a big deal if it's true. On January 7, 1961, Lee Harvey Oswald traveled to Minsk via train. Once he made it to Minsk, the mayor gave him a rent-free apartment overlooking the Fishlock River. Most Soviets had to wait years for own apartment. But Oswald got one right away. He was a minor celebrity, being the only American living in Minsk. Oswald started his job as a metalworker at the Belarusian radio and television factory the next week. Alejandro Zeiger was Oswald's boss at the factory. Zeiger had 2 teenage daughters that Oswald would often socialize with, and Oswald's boss, Mr. Ziegler, would have long conversations with him over tea and cakes. Lee worked 6 days a week at the factory, and he would spend 3 or 4 nights a week hanging out at the Zeiger home. Ernst Titovets met Oswald in the fall of 1960 at a party at the Zeiger house. Titovets was Oswald's closest friend while he was in the Soviet Union. While they were in Minsk, Titovets had access to a tape recorder and made tapes of Oswald's southern accent as a way for him to better learn the English language. The recordings still exist today. Oswald and Titovets take turns role-playing at one point. There's a really interesting clip where Oswald is pretending to be a fictional murderer named Jack Maher. He says some pretty awful stuff. Let's hear what it is he was saying on these tapes.
Shoot up everybody in the goddamn place.
Will you tell us about your last killing?
Well, it was a young girl under a bridge. She came in carrying a loaf of bread, and I just cut her throat from ear to ear.
What for?
Well, I wanted the loaf of bread, of course.
And what do you think to be your most famous killing in your life?
Well, the time I killed 8 men on the Bowery sidewalk there, they were just standing there loafing around. I didn't like their faces, so I just shot them all with a machine gun. It was very, very famous. All the newspapers carried the story. Well, it's all the same to me. I don't know. They're going to execute me tomorrow anyway. So, well, they're coming to get me now. I have to go. So long.
It's crazy to hear a recording of Oswald doing this improv riff to impress his Russian buddy. The part about being executed was a few years early, but eerily prevalent nonetheless. The local KGB kept Oswald under constant surveillance. They put people in front of him that said they had secret information to see how Oswald would react. His apartment was bugged, and one of his friends in Minsk, who would sometimes help interpret for him, Rosa Kivalskova, was a KGB informant. Oswald had several different girlfriends while he was in Russia before he met Marina. He wrote in his diary that he slept with a Russian girl named Anna 4 or 5 times in the fall of 1960, until she moved away from Minsk. A few months later, Oswald spent New Year's Eve 1961 at a friend's house. He spent the night at the home of fellow factory worker Ella German. And according to Oswald, German turned down his more than dishonorable advances on New Year's Eve. Nevertheless, Oswald proposed to her the next day, and she said no because of, quote, lack of love, and because he was an American and someday might be arrested. Then Oswald quickly moved on to a girl named Nelia for the rest of January and most of February. This is how he described her. Nelia at first does not seem to warrant attention since she is rather plain-looking and frighteningly large. But I felt at once that she was kind and her passions were proportional to her size, a fact to be found out only after a great deal of research. On February 13, 1961, the U.S. Embassy received an undated letter from Oswald where he said he had become disillusioned in the Soviet Union and wanted to return to the United States so long as he wouldn't be prosecuted. The Soviets intercepted and read Oswald's letter to the U.S. Embassy, and after that they promptly cut off his monthly subsidies. There was no U.S. Embassy in Minsk, so Oswald had to go back and forth with letters to Moscow. He asked if he could obtain his passport through the mail, but the embassy required him to personally appear in Moscow to confirm he had not renounced his citizenship. On March 31, 1961, an inner office memo at the passport office sheds light on why Oswald was required to come to the embassy in person to get his passport. The memo says, quote, "It has been stated that there is an imposter using Oswald's identification data, and that no doubt the Soviets would love to get a hold of his valid passport. It is my opinion that the passport should be delivered only on a personal basis. This idea of an imposter using Oswald's identification data, especially in the context of passports, was later apparently confirmed. After President Kennedy was assassinated, Senator Richard Russell, who served on the Warren Commission, asked his friend and former Army intelligence Colonel Philip Corso to look into the matter. Corso contacted the head of the U.S. Passport Office, Francis Knight, who told him that there were 2 passports issued to Lee Harvey Oswald, and they had been used by 2 different people. That is a monumental discovery by Colonel Corso, the same man, by the way, that disclosed a lot of undisclosed information regarding the Air Force withholding from the American people their true knowledge of unknown flying objects. But that is a story for another time. I just thought it prudent to include that tidbit of information about Colonel Philip Corso. So this concludes this episode of Oswald's time in Russia, and we will be looking into additional details of his time spent there in future episodes. So keep an eye out for that. I would ask that you hit the like button if you like our content, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Until next time, stay happy and remain curious.